You have no idea who you're talking to. It started in a packed federal courtroom in Atlanta, Georgia, on a rainy Tuesday morning, one of those mornings where the tension in the air feels heavier than the clouds outside. The courtroom was overflowing, not just with lawyers and journalists, but with eyes. Eyes of a nation waiting to see what would happen when one of the most vocal defenders of American democracy, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, came face to face with Kash Patel, Trump's controversial former defense aide turned legal provocateur. As Crockett walked in, she wasn't wearing armor, but you could feel her strength like a pulse, a calm dignity. You could tell this wasn't about a headline. This wasn't about clout. This was personal. She had seen too much lying, too much corruption, too much pain inflicted on everyday Americans by men who thought they could manipulate the law like a press conference. Across from her sat Patel, grinning slightly, cocky in that way only men who've never faced real accountability can be. He didn't bring legal briefs. He brought confidence, tweets, and talking points. And in his mind, that was enough. But today it wasn't. Judge Miriam Hall, known for her silence and her sharp rulings, opened the hearing with a brief nod. No drama, no delays. And just like that, Crockett stepped forward, not as a congresswoman, not as a media figure, but as someone who had had enough. This court isn't about noise, she said quietly, almost too softly to hear. It's about truth. And then everything changed. She didn't yell. She didn't throw accusations. She told a story about a mother in Arkansas who was deported because of a clerical error, about a black veteran in Ohio who was denied benefits after being misclassified by a policy Patel had championed, about communities Patel never visited, people he never saw, lives he had affected without remorse. The courtroom got quieter with every word. Even Patel shifted in his seat. Because this wasn't a campaign rally. This was someone speaking from the soul. You turned national security into a weapon, she said, looking directly at him. And now you sit here thinking you can twist the law into your next soundbite. But not today. People say courtrooms are about law, but sometimes they're about justice, and sometimes, if you're lucky, you witness someone brave enough to carry both. By the time Patel tried to respond, his voice cracked. Because what do you say when your whole defense is built on deflection and someone finally looks you in the eye and calls it out? You go quiet. Jasmine didn't win over the judge with rhetoric. She won by showing that beneath all the politics, there are still people who care, people who fight, people who bleed truth. And as Judge Hall leaned forward, folding her hands slowly, you could feel it coming. Something real, something permanent. But before I tell you what she said, make sure to like this video and subscribe, because what's about to happen next you won't believe. And one more thing before we continue. Have you ever been in a situation where someone tried to use power or status to silence the truth? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear your stories. The silence was louder than words. Judge Hall didn't speak for a long time. She just stared, first at Patel, then at Crockett. The silence was uncomfortable, the kind that forces people to confront themselves. You could hear nothing but the faint hum of the courtroom lights and the soft ticking of the antique clock on the back wall. Seconds passed like hours. Then finally, she spoke. "Mr. Patel," she said, her voice steady, "do you have any legal basis, any to support what you've submitted to this court?" He cleared his throat. "Your Honor, the executive has wide authority when it comes to national—" She cut him off. "Legal basis, Mr. Patel, not political slogans." That was the moment it became clear. This wasn't going to go the way Patel had planned. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't smile. She just waited. Like someone who'd waited too long already, for justice, for honesty, for someone to finally say enough. Patel shuffled his papers. He reached for his tablet. He began referencing outdated memos, vague statutes, anything he could reach for. But the more he spoke, the more everyone in the room realized he wasn't prepared. Not for this, not for her, because Jasmine hadn't come to play politics. She came with the law. She came with case precedent, constitutional arguments, community impact statements. She didn't come to win an argument. She came to prove the truth. And she wasn't just prepared. She was ready. "May I respond, Your Honor?" she asked quietly, almost gently. The judge nodded. Crockett took a single step forward. "The Constitution doesn't bend for fear," she said. It doesn't yield to strong men. It protects the people, all of them. And Mr. Patel's policies didn't just fail to do that, they deliberately ignored it. She began listing names, not statistics. Names. A 14-year-old boy in Detroit whose family was separated for months without cause. A woman in El Paso detained without charge for 63 days. A young dreamer who missed a scholarship interview because ICE agents raided her home at 5 a.m. These weren't just stories, they were indictments. And as Crockett spoke, you could see the courtroom transform. This wasn't just legal testimony, it was a mirror. A painful, unflinching mirror held up to a system that had stopped seeing people as people. Patel was sweating now, his face turned red. He tried to object, but the judge didn't even look at him. "Let her finish," she said simply. And Jasmine did, not with fury, but with focus, not with insults, but with clarity, the kind of clarity that comes from fighting too long to be ignored again. "Mr. Patel wants you to believe this is about politics," she concluded. "But it's not. It's about people, and whether this courtroom is willing to protect them." For a moment, no one spoke. No one moved, because they all knew something had shifted. You ever witness someone stand up and say exactly what needed to be said, even when it was hard? Tell us in the comments below. Your voice might be the one that inspires someone else to speak up. The breaking point. Kash Patel couldn't sit still. He tapped his pen, shifted in his chair, glanced at his counsel. But nothing could stop the truth from wrapping around him like a vice. For the first time in his career, he was cornered, not by politics, not by headlines, but by the raw, undeniable weight of the law, and by Jasmine Crockett. Judge Hall turned her gaze back to Patel. Her voice was soft, almost maternal, but there was steel behind every syllable. "Mr. Patel," she said slowly, "you were a senior advisor to the Department of Defense. You knew the difference between policy and law. So I'll ask you again, under what legal authority did you support these actions?" Patel stuttered. "Your Honor, we were operating under the belief that—" "No," she interrupted gently but firmly, "we are not here for beliefs. We are here for facts." The silence that followed was merciless. Jasmine stood still, watching him, not with triumph but with restraint. She wasn't there to humiliate him. That wasn't her style. She wanted something more dangerous to men like Patel: accountability. And then, like someone who just realized the gravity of where he was, Patel said something no one expected. "Congresswoman Crockett," he muttered, "you're politicizing this hearing." The words hit the room like a slap in the face. Jasmine blinked, then stepped forward slowly. Her voice didn't rise, it lowered, and somehow that made it more powerful. "You think this is politics?" she whispered. "You think fighting for people who've been broken by this system is a political stunt?" She turned to the gallery, filled with lawyers, press, families. Her voice wavered, not from weakness, but from holding back tears. "Let me tell you about politics, Mr. Patel," she said, trembling slightly. "Politics is what you hide behind when you can't explain why a child was put in a cage. Politics is what you call it when someone finally says no more. But this right here, isn't politics. This is me refusing to stay quiet while people like you turn public service into cruelty." The room froze. A few gasps, a few eyes welling up. Even Judge Hall looked momentarily shaken. Patel opened his mouth again, but no sound came out. Because how do you respond to someone who's carrying the pain of 1,000 silenced voices and choosing to speak anyway? This wasn't about Jasmine anymore. It was about what she represented. And at that moment, every single person in that courtroom saw her for what she truly was: a protector, a fighter, a threat to anyone who thought power meant never having to say sorry. Have you ever been accused of making things political just for standing up for what's right? Leave a comment. You're not alone. Her voice was stronger than the system. Judge Hall took a long breath. You could tell she was holding something in, something heavy. She looked over at Jasmine, and for the first time, the mask of judicial neutrality slipped just a little. There was respect in her eyes, a silent acknowledgement. Then she turned to Patel. "Mr. Patel," she said, her voice now firmer than ever, "you came into this courtroom with a presumption that politics would shield you, that your connections, Your past titles, your ability to deflect would carry you through. But this is a federal courtroom, and in this space, your titles mean nothing without truth behind them. You could hear the judge's gavel in every word, even though she hadn't struck it once. Patel sank slightly in his seat, his hands folded together, tight. The smirk that had once danced at the corner of his mouth was gone now, replaced with a kind of hollow realization. He had misjudged not just the courtroom, but her. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't grin. She just stood tall, hands folded in front of her, steady as a lighthouse in a storm. And then Judge Hall looked back at her. "Congresswoman Crockett," she began, "this court thanks you, not for your title, but for your preparation, your clarity, and most importantly, for refusing to let the Constitution be treated like a campaign flyer." There was no applause, no cheers. But if you'd been there, you'd have felt it, the collective heartbeat of everyone in the room picking up just a little. Because justice doesn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes it comes with quiet moments like this. Moments where someone finally says the thing that's been buried too long. Then Patel did something no one expected. He stood up, and without being asked, he said the words no one thought would leave his mouth. "I was wrong." A hush fell. He looked down, ashamed. "I didn't prepare for this like I should have. I treated this like a political game, and I apologize." You could hear someone in the gallery gasp. Jasmine blinked, stunned. She wasn't expecting it. Maybe no one was. But that's what truth does when it's spoken with courage. It breaks walls, even the ones built on arrogance and denial. Judge Hall nodded. "Apology noted, but this hearing isn't about redemption, Mr. Patel. It's about consequences." She turned to her clerk and gave a single nod. But before the ruling came down, Jasmine spoke once more. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "if I may." Hall raised an eyebrow. "I didn't come here to watch a man fall. I came here to make sure no one else has to." That was Jasmine Crockett, always looking beyond the moment, beyond revenge, towards something more powerful, healing. And that's when Judge Hall gave the most powerful gesture of all. She smiled, just a little. Have you ever seen someone change, not because they were forced, but because they were faced with undeniable truth? Tell us in the comments. We want to hear about the moments that moved you. A ruling that echoed beyond the room. Judge Hall adjusted her glasses and picked up the ruling she had written by hand the night before. A quiet preparation, done in solitude, far away from cameras, pressure, and headlines. She always did it this way, because when the law speaks, it must be measured, intentional, and unshakable. Her voice was calm but resolute. This court finds that the policies advocated by Mr. Patel not only lack legal foundation, but represent a dangerous attempt to politicize executive power beyond the limits set by the Constitution. A tremor passed through the gallery. It wasn't shock, it was relief. She continued, "Furthermore, the evidence and arguments brought forth by Congresswoman Crockett demonstrate not only a superior understanding of the law, but a moral clarity that this courtroom rarely sees in public office." Jasmine stood frozen, not because she was surprised, but because the weight of justice is always heavy, even when it lands where it should. Judge Hall looked down at her papers for a moment, then back up. Her voice dropped slightly in volume but deepened in gravity. "Let this serve as a reminder. The courtroom is not a stage for theatrics. It is not a sanctuary for political survival. It is the last refuge for truth when every other institution has bent or broken." At that line, Patel closed his eyes. The ruling concluded with a formal rejection of Patel's arguments and a statement that certain aspects of the challenge policy would be suspended pending further review. But no legal document could capture what had truly happened in that room, because something else shifted that day. Not just policy, but public trust. As the judge stood to adjourn the hearing, reporters scrambled to send live updates. Twitter exploded. Cable news anchors interrupted programming. The phrase "Crockett shuts down Patel" was already trending. And Jasmine? She didn't celebrate. She quietly collected her documents, gave a gentle nod to the judge, and turned to leave. But just before she stepped outside, a woman from the gallery called out. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice breaking. Thank you for fighting for us. Jasmine turned surprised. It was the mother of one of the children she had mentioned in her testimony. Tears streamed down the woman's face. Jasmine walked over, held her hand, and whispered something no microphone picked up. But the woman smiled through her tears. That was the moment people would remember. Not the legal arguments, not even the ruling, but a congresswoman holding the hand of a grieving mother. Have you ever seen a politician do something, not for power, but for people? Leave a comment. Let's talk about the ones who still care. When the world finally watched, outside the courthouse a storm had passed, but inside something far more powerful had just begun. Cameras swarmed the steps as Jasmine Crockett emerged, not as a politician on a media tour, but as someone who had just carried the weight of a broken system on her shoulders and refused to let it collapse. Reporters shouted her name, microphones extended like spears, but she didn't rush, she didn't spin, she paused, and then she spoke, without a script, without notes, just with heart. This wasn't about me, she said. It wasn't even about Kash Patel. It was about the people we serve, the people forgotten in policy memos and erased in legal loopholes. Today, they were heard. Her voice cracked, not from nerves, but from truth. She looked tired, not in the way politicians look after long days, but in the way people look when they've fought battles that aren't theirs to fight, but fought them anyway. Inside the courthouse, Judge Hall was still at her bench, reflecting in silence. She had issued many rulings, but this one would be remembered, not because of the legal precedent, but because the courtroom, for once, felt more like a nation's conscience. Kash Patel, for his heartburn, left through a side exit. No cameras, no statements, just silence. The kind that comes after your own reflection stares back and asks, who did you really help? But the real aftermath wasn't in legal blogs or headlines. It was in the ripple. Across the country, law students studied Jasmine's arguments as examples of pure advocacy. Churches replayed her closing words during sermons. Families in detention centers asked about the woman on TV who finally said what they couldn't, and something incredible began to happen. People started believing again. Not in government, but in accountability, in decency, in the idea that someone could still walk into a courtroom and speak for those without a microphone. In Washington, some rolled their eyes, called it a performance, said it was all for show. But if you looked at the faces of those who watched, really watched, you'd know better. Because when someone fights for the truth and does it with grace, humility, and fire, it doesn't feel like a performance. It feels like hope. And Jasmine Crockett gave people hope. Have you ever witnessed a moment that made you believe justice is still possible? Leave a comment. We're listening. The sentence that shook a nation. A week later, the footage was still everywhere. Clips of Jasmine's closing arguments had been replayed on every major news network. Her calm stare, her steady voice, the moment she said, "This isn't about politics, it's about people." That sentence alone had been shared over 3 million times. But the moment that truly made history wasn't caught by the media. It happened in a dimly lit law school lecture hall in Baltimore. A young woman, first year, daughter of immigrants, quiet as a shadow, stood up after watching Jasmine's hearing during a constitutional law class. She didn't ask about procedure. She didn't cite precedent. She simply said, "I didn't know someone like me could stand up like that until I saw her do it." And that's how the real change began. Because what Jasmine Crockett did in that courtroom didn't just shut down Kash Patel. It woke people up. She showed America what it looks like when someone refuses to let fear rewrite the truth. She reminded us that courage doesn't shout. It stands still while others run from the fire. Back in Washington, as talk of reform picked up, something else happened. Jasmine received a letter, not from a supporter, not from a donor, but from the daughter of the woman she held hands with outside the courthouse. In the letter, she wrote, "You don't know us, but you fought for us." I watched my mom cry that night, not from sadness, but because for the first time in years, someone in power made her feel like she mattered. Thank you for giving her back her voice. That letter never made the news. Jasmine kept it folded in her wallet, right behind her congressional ID. Because while titles can fade, impact doesn't. As for Kash Patel, his influence quietly waned. He stopped appearing on cable news. The think tank stopped calling, not because of one bad hearing, but because in 1 hour, Jasmine exposed the truth. Loud isn't the same as right, and confidence isn't the same as competence. Judge Hall's ruling was eventually cited in 2 appellate decisions. Law students quoted it in their finals. Civil rights lawyers referenced it in their pleadings. And slowly the legal world began to shift, not in grand gestures, but in the way it always does, quietly, with purpose. But through it all, Jasmine Crockett never changed. She kept showing up, kept fighting for the forgotten. And every time someone told her it was hopeless, she'd smile and say, "I've already seen what happens when we stop being afraid to tell the truth." So if you ever wonder whether one voice can make a difference, remember her. Remember that courtroom. Remember what happens when law and heart speak as one. And if this story moved you even a little, don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might just be yours. Now it's your turn. Have you ever seen someone stand up and speak truth when it mattered most? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one.